The morning sun cast long shadows across the railroad tracks that cut through the prairie like a steel scar. Sarah Mitchell pressed her face against the cold iron rail, her wrists burning from the rough rope that bound them. The metal vibrated beneath her cheek, sending shivers through her body that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. Her father stood 20 feet away, his weathered hands shaking as he clutched a half-empty whiskey bottle. Thomas Mitchell had once been a proud railroad foreman, respected in their small frontier town. But the bottle had stolen that man away, leaving behind someone Sarah barely recognized. His eyes, once kind and full of laughter, now held a wild desperation that terrified her. "Papa, please," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind that swept across the endless grassland. "I didn't mean to spill the soup. I was just trying to help." Thomas took another long drink, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Help?" he spat, his words slurred and bitter. "You're just like your mother, always making mistakes, always disappointing me. Maybe if I'd been harder on her, she wouldn't have run off with that traveling salesman." Sarah's heart ached at the mention of her mother. Elizabeth Mitchell had disappeared 3 months ago, leaving only a note saying she couldn't bear the drinking and violence anymore. But she had promised to come back for Sarah. Every night Sarah waited by the window, hoping to see her mother's familiar silhouette walking up the dusty road. The rope cut deeper into her wrists as she struggled against her bonds. Her father had used the same knots he tied when securing cargo to the freight cars. He knew his knots well, perhaps too well. The more she fought, the tighter they became. "The 3:15 freight train comes through here every day," Thomas muttered, checking his pocket watch with unsteady hands. "Right on time, just like clockwork. Maybe when they find you, people will finally understand the pain I've been carrying." Sarah's blood ran cold. The 3:15 train was the heavy freight that carried coal and timber from the northern mines. It traveled fast through this stretch, the engineer never expecting anything on the tracks in this remote area. Her father had chosen this spot carefully, far from town where no one would hear her screams. "Papa, this isn't you talking," Sarah pleaded, tears streaming down her dirty cheeks. "It's the whiskey. Remember when you used to tell me stories about the railroad? About how it connected people and brought families together? You said the tracks were like lifelines across the country." For a moment, something flickered in Thomas's eyes, a ghost of the man he used to be. He had indeed told her those stories back when she was small and would sit on his lap in the evenings. He would describe the great locomotives as iron horses carrying dreams and hopes across the vast American landscape. But the moment passed as quickly as it came. Thomas shook his head violently as if trying to dislodge unwanted memories. "Those were lies, just pretty stories. The railroad took everything from me. 20 years I gave them, and when I started drinking, they threw me out like yesterday's garbage." The distant sound of a train whistle echoed across the prairie, still far off but growing closer. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had maybe an hour before the freight train reached this section of track. "Someone will come," she whispered to herself, trying to stay calm. "Someone always comes." But as she looked around at the endless expanse of grassland, broken only by scattered sagebrush and the occasional prairie dog mound, she realized how foolish that hope was. This was one of the most isolated sections of the railroad, chosen specifically because it was far from any settlement or farm. Thomas stumbled closer, his boots crunching on the gravel between the railroad ties. "I'm sorry it has to be this way, Sarah, but you'll be with your mother soon enough. Maybe she'll take better care of you than I did." "Mama's not dead, Papa," Sarah said firmly, though her voice trembled. "She's coming back for me," she promised. Her father's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Your mother ain't coming back, girl. I got word from Sheriff Patterson last week. Elizabeth and that salesman were killed in a stagecoach accident outside Denver. She's been dead for 2 months." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her mother was gone forever, and now her father planned to join her in whatever madness had consumed his mind. She was truly alone in the world, tied to railroad tracks with death approaching on steel wheels. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Sarah remembered something her mother had taught her. Elizabeth Mitchell had been raised by Lakota people after her own parents died in an Indian attack. She had learned their ways, their stories, and their unbreakable spirit. The Lakota believed that the Great Spirit watches over all children, her mother had once told her during a fierce thunderstorm. No matter how dark things get, there is always light coming if you're brave enough to wait for it. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to channel that brave spirit her mother had spoken of. If she was going to die on these tracks, she wouldn't spend her last moments in terror. She would face whatever came with the courage of the Lakota people who had raised her mother. The train whistle sounded again, closer now. Thomas had walked back to his horse, mounted, and was riding away without looking back. He couldn't watch what he had set in motion, but he also couldn't bring himself to untie the ropes. As the sound of his horse's hooves faded into the distance, Sarah was left alone with the wind, the vast sky, and the steady rhythm of approaching doom. The tracks beneath her began to vibrate more noticeably, and she knew the freight train was getting closer. She thought of her mother's stories about Lakota warriors who could read the signs in nature, who could hear messages in the wind and see hope where others saw only death. Elizabeth had told her that the Lakota never gave up, never stopped fighting, even when facing impossible odds. "Great Spirit," Sarah whispered, using words her mother had taught her. "If you're watching, please send someone to help me. I'm not ready to join my mother yet. I have too much living left to do." The wind seemed to answer her prayer, carrying on it the faint sound of horse hooves. But this wasn't her father returning. These hooves belonged to an unshod horse, moving with the quiet grace that only wild ponies possessed. Through the shimmering heat waves rising from the sun-baked earth, Sarah saw a figure approaching on horseback. The rider sat straight and proud, moving as one with his mount in a way that reminded her of the Lakota warriors from her mother's stories. Hope flickered in her chest like a small flame refusing to be extinguished by the wind. The rider emerged from the heat shimmer like a vision from another world. He was Lakota, that much Sarah could tell even from a distance. He sat his painted pony with the natural grace of someone born to the saddle, his long black hair flowing behind him as he approached. Despite the danger of her situation, Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her. As he drew closer, she could see he was young, perhaps 20 summers, with the lean build of a hunter. He wore traditional buckskin clothing decorated with intricate beadwork, and a bone choker encircled his throat. Most striking were his eyes, dark as winter nights but filled with an intensity that seemed to see everything at once. The young warrior reined in his pony about 10 feet from the tracks, studying the scene before him. His gaze moved from Sarah's bound form to the approaching train tracks, then to the hoofprints left by her father's horse. In those few moments of silent observation, he seemed to understand the entire situation. "I am called Lakota," he said in accented but clear English, dismounting from his pony with fluid grace. "It means friend to everyone in my language. Your mother spoke of you often." Sarah's eyes widened in shock. "You knew my mother?" Lakota moved swiftly to her side, pulling a sharp hunting knife from his belt. "Elizabeth White Dove was like a sister to my grandmother. She learned our ways when she was young, before the white man's world claimed her. My grandmother mourned greatly when she heard of Elizabeth's death." As he began cutting through the thick ropes, Sarah felt tears of relief streaming down her face. "Papa told me she was dead, but I didn't want to believe it." "Death is not an ending," Lakota said gently, working at the stubborn knots. "Your mother's spirit lives on in you. I can see her strength in your eyes, the way you face danger without breaking." The rope around her wrists finally gave way, and Sarah rubbed the raw skin where it had cut into her flesh. But even as relief flooded through her, the sound of the approaching train grew louder, its whistle echoing across the prairie with increasing urgency. "Can you walk?" Lakota asked, helping her to her feet. Sarah's legs were stiff from being bound, but she managed to stand. "Yes, but why were you here? This place is so far from everything." Lakota gathered the cut ropes, examining them with the careful attention of a tracker. "I was hunting elk in the hills when I saw the smoke from your town. Something felt wrong, so I followed the feeling. My grandmother taught me to listen to the spirits when they whisper warnings." He led her away from the tracks toward his pony, but Sarah stopped suddenly. "Wait, my father, he's sick in his mind from drinking. He doesn't know what he's done. When people find out he tried to kill me, they'll hang him for sure." The young Lakota warrior studied her face with new respect. "Even after what he did to you, you would protect him?" "He's still my father," Sarah said quietly. "Before the drinking, he was a good man. My mother used to say that sometimes people get lost in their own darkness, but that doesn't mean they can't find their way back to the light." Lakota nodded slowly. "Your mother's wisdom runs deep in you. But we must move quickly. The iron horse approaches, and soon people will come looking when the train stops." As if summoned by his words, The freight train rounded the distant bend, its massive locomotive belching black smoke into the clear afternoon sky. The engineer would spot the disturbance soon enough and stop to investigate. "We need to make it look like an accident," Sarah said, her mind racing. "If they find evidence that someone was tied to the tracks on purpose, they'll know it was attempted murder." Dakota gathered the rope pieces and stuffed them into his buckskin pouch. "You think like a warrior. What else needs to be hidden?" Sarah looked around desperately, trying to spot any other evidence of what had really happened. The ground was dusty and hard, perfect for showing footprints and hoof marks. Her father's horse had left clear tracks, as had Dakota's pony. "The tracks," she said urgently. "Anyone who knows how to read sign will see that 2 different horses were here, and that someone was dragged to the railroad." Dakota was already moving, using a branch to sweep away the most obvious marks. "Can you ride double?" he asked. "I've been riding since I was 5, Sarah replied, accepting his help onto the painted pony's back. As they rode away from the tracks, Sarah looked back to see the freight train beginning to slow. The engineer had spotted something on the rails ahead, probably the disturbed gravel where she had been bound. She knew he would stop and investigate, as railroad men were trained to do. "Where can we go?" Sarah asked as Dakota guided his pony into a dry creek bed that would hide their tracks. "Everyone in town knows me. If I just show up, they'll ask questions." "My grandmother's lodge is hidden in the hills above the valley," Dakota replied. "She has been expecting you." "Expecting me? But how could she know? She dreamed of a white dove in chains 3 nights ago. In her dream, the dove was freed by a young warrior, but great danger still followed. She told me to be ready to help when the time came." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Her mother's Lakota name had been White Dove, chosen for her gentle nature and pure spirit. The fact that Dakota's grandmother had seen her in a dream seemed impossible. Yet here was the proof riding behind her on a painted pony. The creek bed wound through a series of low hills covered with scrub oak and pine. As they climbed higher, Sarah could see the smoke from the stopped train far below. Small figures moved around the locomotive like ants, and she knew the investigation had begun. "What will happen when they don't find a body?" she asked. "They will search," Dakota said simply. "Your father will tell them you are missing, probably claim you ran away. But some will be suspicious. White men's justice is often swift and harsh." Sarah nodded grimly. She had seen hangings in their frontier town, and the crowds that gathered to watch them like they were entertainment. If anyone suspected her father of attempted murder, he wouldn't live to see another sunrise. "There has to be another way," she said. "Some way to protect him without letting him hurt anyone else." Dakota guided his pony up a steep trail that seemed to appear and disappear among the rocks. "My grandmother is wise in the ways of both worlds. She will know what to do." As they climbed higher into the hills, Sarah felt as though she was leaving her old life behind with every step. The girl who had been tied to those tracks, who had lived in fear of her father's drunken rages, felt like a stranger now. Something had changed in those moments of facing death. Some inner strength had awakened that she had never known she possessed. The painted pony topped a ridge, and suddenly the world opened up before them. A hidden valley spread below, green and sheltered, with a clear stream running through its center. Near the stream stood a traditional Lakota lodge, its buffalo hide covering painted with symbols that seemed to dance in the afternoon light. An elderly woman emerged from the lodge as if she had been waiting for their arrival. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the dignity in her bearing and the wisdom in her silver hair. This had to be Dakota's grandmother, the one who had raised her mother and taught her the ways of the Lakota people. "She is called Winona," Dakota said softly. "It means firstborn daughter. She was the first child born to her tribe after they arrived in this valley many winters ago." As they rode down into the hidden sanctuary, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since her mother had disappeared, she felt truly safe. Winona waited by the stream as they approached, her weathered hands folded calmly in front of her. She was smaller than Sarah had expected, but there was something about her presence that commanded respect. Her dark eyes held depths of wisdom that seemed to span generations, and when she looked at Sarah, it felt as though she was seeing straight into her soul. "White Dove's daughter," Winona said in accented English, her voice carrying the weight of years but still strong. "You have your mother's courage, but also your father's stubborn spirit. Both will serve you well in the trials ahead." Sarah slid down from the pony, her legs still shaky from her ordeal. "Dakota said you were expecting me, but I don't understand how you could know." The old woman smiled, revealing teeth that were still white despite her age. "The spirits speak to those who know how to listen. Your mother visited my dreams for 3 nights, warning me that her daughter would need sanctuary. She also told me that the path ahead would be dangerous for all involved." Dakota led his pony to the stream to drink, while the 2 women studied each other. Sarah saw kindness in Winona's ancient face, but also a shrewdness that spoke of someone who had survived many hardships. "My father," Sarah began hesitantly. "He's lost his way since Mama died. The drinking has made him do terrible things, but deep inside he's still the man who used to read me stories and teach me about the railroad." Winona nodded knowingly. "Grief can poison a man's spirit like bad water. But tell me, child, what do you wish to do? You could disappear into the wilderness with us, live as the Lakota do. Your father would believe you dead and you would be free of his madness." The offer was tempting. Sarah looked around the peaceful valley, imagining a life free from fear and violence. But as she considered it, she realized she couldn't simply run away from the problem. "That wouldn't be right," she said finally. "If I disappear, Papa will either drink himself to death from guilt or he might hurt someone else. And the railroad investigators will keep looking until they find answers. Innocent people could get blamed." "Spoken like your mother," Winona said with approval. "Elizabeth always chose the harder path when it meant protecting others." "Very well, then we must find another way." As the sun began to set, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Winona prepared a simple meal of venison stew and cornbread. They sat around a small fire outside the lodge, and Sarah found herself telling the full story of what had led to her father's desperate act. "He lost his job 6 months ago," she explained, stirring the stew with a wooden spoon. "The railroad said he was drinking too much to be safe around the trains. Then Mama left and he got worse. He kept talking about how everyone had betrayed him, how the whole world was against him." Dakota poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. "Men like that are dangerous because they have nothing left to lose. Even if you save him this time, what happens the next time his demons overcome him?" Winona was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if seeing visions there. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "There is an old Lakota story about a warrior whose mind was poisoned by evil spirits. The tribe could not kill him because he was family, but they could not let him harm innocent people either." "What did they do?" Sarah asked, leaning forward. "They gave him a choice," Winona continued. "He could undergo a ritual purification that would cleanse the evil spirits from his mind, but it would require him to face his deepest fears and admit his wrongs. Or he could be banished forever from the tribe, left to wander alone until the spirits claimed him." Sarah considered this carefully. "Do you think such a ritual could help my father?" "The ritual was never about magic," Winona said with a knowing smile. "It was about forcing the person to confront the truth of what they had become. Sometimes that shock is enough to break through the darkness that clouds their spirit." Meanwhile, down in the town below, Sheriff Patterson was conducting his investigation of the mysterious incident at the railroad tracks. The train engineer had found clear evidence that someone had been on the tracks, but no body. The gravel was disturbed, and there were rope fibers caught on the iron rails. Thomas Mitchell sat in his kitchen, staring at an empty whiskey bottle and trying to work up the courage to ride back to the tracks. Part of him hoped to find Sarah's body so he could end his own misery with the gun in his desk drawer. Another part of him desperately hoped she had somehow escaped, though he couldn't imagine how. The knock on his door came just after full dark. Sheriff Patterson stood on the porch with 2 deputies, their faces grim in the lamplight. "Evening, Tom," the sheriff said carefully. "We need to talk about your daughter." Thomas felt his heart stop. "Sarah? What about Sarah?" Train engineer found signs of trouble out at mile marker 47. "Looked like someone was tied to the tracks, but there was no body. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" For a moment, Thomas considered lying, but the guilt was eating him alive from the inside. "She ran away," he said weakly. "Yesterday morning after we had an argument. I haven't seen her since." Sheriff Patterson studied his face carefully. The lawman had known Thomas for 15 years, and he could smell the desperation coming off him like a fever sweat. "That's interesting, Tom, because Mrs. Henderson saw Sarah hanging laundry yesterday afternoon. Said she looked fine then. And old Pete from the livery says you rented a horse around 2 o'clock. Came back an hour later looking like you'd seen a ghost. Back in the hidden valley." Winona was teaching Sarah about the healing properties of various plants that grew along the stream. But their peaceful lesson was interrupted by the distant sound of horses and shouting voices. "Search party," Dakota said grimly, rising from where he'd been sharpening his hunting knife. "They're checking all the canyons and valleys." Sarah felt panic rise in her chest. "If they find me here, they'll know Papa was lying. They'll arrest him for sure." Winona stood slowly, her old bones creaking in protest. "Then we must give them something else to find." "Dakota, how well do you know the old mine shaft in Dead Horse Canyon?" The young warrior's eyes lit up with understanding. "Well enough. You think we should stage another rescue?" "Sometimes the best way to hide the truth is to wrap it in a different truth," Winona said cryptically. "Sarah, are you willing to be rescued twice in one day?" Sarah looked between the old woman and her grandson, seeing a plan forming in their eyes. "What do you have in mind?" Winona smiled, and for the first time since Sarah had met her, the expression held a hint of mischief. "We're going to give your father a chance at redemption. But first we need to make sure the sheriff's search party finds exactly what we want them to find." As the voices of the searchers grew closer, Sarah realized that her ordeal was far from over. But now she had allies, people who understood both worlds she lived between. Together they might find a way to save her father from himself without destroying innocent lives in the process. The night was young, and their most dangerous game was just beginning. The plan was audacious in its simplicity, but it required perfect timing and a bit of luck. As the search party's torches flickered through the darkness below, Winona explained what needed to happen. "Dead Horse Canyon has an old silver mine that flooded years ago," she said, sketching a rough map in the dirt with her finger. "The entrance is hidden behind fallen rocks, and most people think it's completely sealed. But there's a narrow passage that leads to a dry chamber deep inside." Dakota nodded, understanding his grandmother's thinking. "If Sarah appears to be trapped in the mine, it gives us a reason for her to be missing without making her father look guilty of trying to murder her." "But how do we make it look convincing?" Sarah asked, watching the distant torches grow closer to their valley. Winona produced a small leather pouch from inside her lodge. "Your mother left this with me years ago, said it might be useful someday. Inside are some of her belongings, things that would identify her to anyone who knew her well." Sarah opened the pouch with trembling fingers. Inside were her mother's silver locket, the one with her father's picture inside, and a small piece of blue ribbon that Sarah remembered from one of her mother's favorite dresses. "We'll leave these near the mine entrance, along with signs that someone tried to dig their way out," Dakota explained. "Then Sarah hides in the back chamber while I discover the cave-in and alert the search party." "What about my father?" Sarah asked. "Even if this keeps him from being arrested for attempted murder, he's still drinking himself to death." Winona's expression grew serious. "That part of the plan is more dangerous, child. We must force him to confront what he almost did. Make him face the darkness in his own spirit. But there are no guarantees he will choose redemption over destruction." The sound of horses grew louder, and they could hear Sheriff Patterson's voice calling out orders to spread the search wider. "Time was running short, I have to try," Sarah said firmly. "I can't just let him destroy himself. Not when there might be a way to save him." They moved quickly through the darkness, Dakota leading the way on trails only he knew. The old mine was a 2-hour ride through treacherous terrain, but the young warrior guided them, safely through ravines and over rocky ledges that would have been impossible to navigate in daylight. Dead Horse Canyon earned its name from the bleached bones of pack animals that had fallen from the narrow trails during the Silver Rush 20 years earlier. The mine entrance was exactly as Winona had described, hidden behind a rockfall that looked natural, but had actually been arranged by human hands. "The miners sealed it when the vein played out," Dakota explained, as they squeezed through the narrow opening. "They didn't want claim jumpers thinking there was still silver to be found." Inside the mine was a maze of tunnels and chambers carved from solid rock. Their torches cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the air was thick with the smell of stagnant water and bat droppings. Sarah tried not to think about being trapped in this place for real. The chamber Winona had mentioned was deep in the mine, accessible through a passage so narrow that Sarah had to crawl on her hands and knees. But once inside, she found a surprisingly large space with a pool of fresh water fed by an underground spring. "This was probably a natural cave before the miners found it," Dakota said, setting his torch in a crack in the wall. You should be safe here, but keep the torch burning low. We don't want smoke giving away your location if someone else enters the mine." They worked quickly to set up the deception. Dakota arranged rocks near the entrance to look like a fresh cave-in, while Sarah reluctantly placed her mother's locket and ribbon where they would be easily found. The hardest part was tearing her own dress and rubbing dirt on her hands and face to look like she'd been digging frantically to escape. "Remember," Winona said as they prepared to leave, Sarah alone in the chamber. "When they find you, you must seem genuinely frightened and confused. Say you were exploring the canyon when the rocks fell and trapped you inside. Don't mention anything about the railroad tracks or your father." Sarah nodded, though the thought of being alone in the dark mine terrified her almost as much as being tied to the railroad tracks had. At least then she'd been under the open sky. Dakota squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. "I'll be back with help before dawn. My grandmother and I will make sure your father is part of the rescue party." As their footsteps faded away, Sarah settled down to wait in the flickering torchlight. The silence in the mine was absolute except for the steady drip of water and the occasional rustle of bats in the upper reaches of the chamber. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Sarah tried to stay calm by thinking about her mother's stories of Lakota warriors who endured vision quests alone in the wilderness. But every shadow seemed to move with malevolent purpose, and every sound echoed strangely in the confined space. Meanwhile, Dakota made his way back toward town, timing his arrival carefully. He needed to encounter the search party at just the right moment to make his discovery seem accidental rather than planned. Sheriff Patterson was questioning Thomas Mitchell again when the young Lakota warrior rode into town. Despite the late hour, word of Sarah's disappearance had spread quickly and several townspeople had joined the search. "Sheriff," Dakota called out, affecting breathlessness as if he'd ridden hard. "I was hunting in Dead Horse Canyon when I heard voices calling. Are you looking for a missing girl?" Patterson studied the young man suspiciously. The relationship between the town and the local Lakota tribe was tense at best, and many of the townspeople didn't trust Indians even when they were trying to help. "What do you know about it?" the sheriff asked carefully. "I found signs of trouble near the old silver mine," Dakota replied. "Fresh rockfall, and there are personal belongings scattered around the entrance. It looks like someone might be trapped inside." Thomas Mitchell, who had been sitting on his porch in drunken despair, suddenly came alive. "Sarah? Is it Sarah?" For the first time, Dakota looked directly at the man who had tried to murder his own daughter. What he saw was a broken human being, destroyed by grief and alcohol but not yet beyond redemption. "The belongings looked like they might belong to a young woman," Dakota said carefully. "But the mine is dangerous. It will take several men to move the rocks safely." Within minutes, a rescue party was organized. Sheriff Patterson selected 6 strong men with mining experience, while the town doctor prepared his medical bag. Thomas Mitchell insisted on coming despite his condition, and the sheriff decided it was better to have him where he could watch him. The ride to Dead Horse Canyon took 2 hours, and Thomas spent every minute in an agony of guilt and hope. If Sarah was really trapped in the mine, it meant she hadn't been killed by the train. But it also meant she was in mortal danger from cave-ins and bad air. As they approached the mine, Dakota pointed out the evidence he and Sarah had so carefully arranged. The sheriff examined the scene with a lawman's eye, noting the disturbed rocks and the personal items that had been dropped during the supposed accident. "These are definitely Sarah's things," Thomas said hoarsely, recognizing the locket immediately. "My God, what if she's been trapped in there all this time?" The rescue began immediately, with the miners working in shifts to move the heavy rocks blocking the entrance. Thomas threw himself into the work with desperate energy, his hands bleeding as he clawed at the stones. "Easy, Tom," Sheriff Patterson cautioned. "We need to be careful not to cause another cave-in." But Thomas couldn't be restrained. The possibility that his daughter was alive, trapped and terrified in the darkness, drove him to superhuman efforts. For the first time in months, he had a purpose beyond drinking and self-pity. Deep in the mine, Sarah heard the sound of voices and digging. Her torch had burned low, and she was beginning to feel the effects of the thin air and stress. When she heard her father's voice, rough with emotion as he called her name, she began to understand the true genius of Winona's plan. This wasn't just about hiding the truth of what had happened at the railroad tracks. It was about giving Thomas Mitchell a chance to be a hero instead of a villain, to save his daughter instead of destroy her. As the rescue party broke through the final barrier, Sarah began to crawl toward the sound of their voices, playing her part in the elaborate deception that might just save them both. The moment Thomas Mitchell saw his daughter's face emerge from the darkness of the mine shaft, something broke open inside his chest. Sarah looked exactly as she should, dirty and frightened, with tears streaming down her cheeks. But she was alive, breathing, reaching toward him with trembling hands. "Papa!" Sarah cried out, and her emotion was genuine even if the circumstances were fabricated. Seeing her father risk his life to save her, watching him bleed as he clawed at the rocks with his bare hands, she realized that somewhere inside the broken man was still the father who had loved her. Thomas pulled her from the narrow opening, crushing her against his chest as sobs racked his body. "I thought I'd lost you forever," he whispered into her hair. "When you didn't come home yesterday, I thought something terrible had happened." The other men gathered around, relief evident on their faces. Sheriff Patterson examined Sarah carefully, looking for signs of serious injury, while Dr. Henderson checked her pulse and breathing. "How long have you been trapped in there, child?" the doctor asked gently. Sarah stuck to their planned story. "Since yesterday afternoon. I was exploring the canyon when I heard rocks falling. I tried to dig my way out, but the stones were too heavy." She looked up at her father with eyes that held no accusation, only gratitude. "I kept hoping someone would find me." Dakota watched from the edge of the group, satisfied that their deception was working. But he could see the real test was just beginning. Getting Sarah out of the mine was the easy part. Healing the wounds between father and daughter would be much harder. As they prepared to ride back to town, Thomas stayed close to Sarah's side as if afraid she might disappear again. His hands shook, but not just from alcohol withdrawal. The terror of almost losing his daughter had shattered something inside him, breaking through the wall of anger and self-pity that had protected him from facing his own actions. "Sarah," he said quietly as they rode double on his horse, "I need to tell you something about yesterday. I was drinking, and I said some terrible things. I don't remember everything, but I know I hurt you. I know I scared you." Sarah felt her heart racing. This was the moment Winona had warned her about, when her father might confess to what he had really done. She had to be very careful with her response. "You were grieving, Papa," she said softly. "People say things they don't mean when they're in pain." But Thomas shook his head, his voice growing more agitated. "No, it was worse than that. I did something unforgivable. I took you to the railroad tracks and I—" His voice broke completely, unable to finish the sentence. Sheriff Patterson, riding nearby, caught some of the conversation and moved his horse closer. "What's that about railroad tracks, Tom?" For a moment, the truth hung in the air like smoke, threatening to destroy their carefully constructed story. Sarah felt Dakota's eyes on her from across the group, and she made a split-second decision. "Papa's still confused from the drinking," she said quickly. "Yesterday, when I didn't come home, he went looking for me everywhere, including near the railroad. He probably blames himself for not finding me sooner." It was a reasonable explanation, and Sheriff Patterson seemed to accept it. But Sarah could see that her father was struggling with something deeper than confusion. The weight of what he had almost done was crushing him from the inside. When they reached town, word of Sarah's rescue had already spread. Mrs. Henderson had prepared hot soup and clean clothes while several other townspeople gathered to welcome her home. But Thomas barely acknowledged their kindness, instead retreating immediately to his house with Sarah. Once they were alone, he sat heavily at the kitchen table and buried his face in his hands. "I remember everything," he said in a voice so low Sarah had to strain to hear it. "I tied you to those tracks. I left you there to die. How can you even look at me?" Sarah sat across from him, choosing her words carefully. "Because you came back for me, Papa. When it mattered most, you saved me." "I didn't save you from the mine," Thomas said, looking up with red-rimmed eyes. "That young Indian did. And I certainly didn't save you from the railroad tracks. Someone else must have cut those ropes because I was too much of a coward to do it myself." The admission hung between them like a confession in church. Sarah realized that her father's guilt was going to destroy him just as surely as his drinking had, unless she could find a way to help him forgive himself. "Mama used to tell me stories about people who lost their way. Sarah said carefully. She said the Lakota believe that everyone has the chance to choose a different path, no matter how dark the road they've been walking. Thomas laughed bitterly. Your mother was too good for this world. She saw goodness in people even when they couldn't see it in themselves. But some things can't be forgiven, Sarah. Some things are too terrible. That night, after Thomas had finally passed out from exhaustion, and the last of his whiskey, Sarah slipped out of the house. She had promised to meet Lakota at the old oak tree behind the church, where they could talk without being seen. The young warrior was waiting for her, his face serious in the moonlight. Your father knows the truth. I could see it in his eyes during the rescue. He's going to destroy himself with guilt, Sarah said. Even though I'm safe, he can't forgive himself for what he almost did. I'm afraid he'll try to hurt himself, or confess everything to the sheriff. Lakota was quiet for a moment, considering. My grandmother said this might happen. She is prepared for this possibility. What do you mean? There is a place, far from here, where men go to find themselves again. It's a ranch run by a man who understands what drink can do to a person's soul. He helps them learn to live without the bottle, and more importantly, to live with the things they've done. Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Would Papa go to such a place? Not willingly, Lakota admitted. But if he truly wants to make amends for what he did, he might be convinced it's the only way to honor your forgiveness. Over the next few days, Thomas Mitchell struggled with sobriety and guilt in equal measure. Without alcohol to numb his thoughts, the memory of tying his daughter to the railroad tracks tormented him every waking moment. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and could barely stand to look at Sarah without seeing the trust in her eyes that he had so completely betrayed. The town celebrated Sarah's rescue as a miracle, but Thomas knew better. Someone had saved his daughter from his own murderous madness, and he had no idea who or why. The not knowing was almost worse than the guilt itself. It was Winona who finally appeared at his door, 3 days after the rescue. She came at sunset when the streets were empty and no one would see an old Lakota woman visiting a white man's house. You are Thomas Mitchell, she said when he answered her knock. It wasn't a question. Yes, he replied, too surprised to say more. He had heard of the old Indian woman who lived in the hills, but he had never seen her up close. I am Winona. I knew your wife when she was young. She asked me to watch over her daughter. Thomas stepped back instinctively. Sarah's at the Henderson place helping with their sick child. She's safe. She is safe because someone cut the ropes at the railroad tracks, Winona said bluntly, stepping into his house without invitation. Someone who knew what you had done and chose to save her rather than let you become a murderer. The words hit Thomas like physical blows. His legs gave out and he collapsed into a chair, staring at the old woman with growing horror. You know, he whispered. You know what I did. Winona studied him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. The question is not what you did in your madness, but what you will do now in your clarity. Will you honor the gift of your daughter's life? Or will you waste it in self-pity and guilt? I don't know how to live with what I've done, Thomas said, tears streaming down his face. I put my own child on those tracks. What kind of monster does that? The kind that can choose to become something else, Winona replied firmly, but only if you are brave enough to do the work of healing your spirit. She reached into her pouch and pulled out a letter, handing it to Thomas with steady hands. There is a place in Colorado where men learn to live without the bottle and to make peace with their demons. The man who runs it was once where you are now, consumed by guilt and drink. He will understand what you face. Thomas took the letter with trembling fingers. Why would you help me, after what I almost did to Sarah? Because your daughter loves you despite everything, Winona said simply. And because your wife asked me to save both her husband and her child, if such a thing were possible. As the old woman prepared to leave, she turned back one final time. The train leaves for Colorado tomorrow at noon. Your daughter will understand if you choose to take it. She knows that sometimes the greatest act of love is having the courage to become worthy of forgiveness. That night, Thomas Mitchell sat, alone in his kitchen, staring at the letter and the train ticket Winona had left with it. Outside, he could hear the distant sound of the evening freight train, its whistle echoing across the prairie like a call to judgment. For the first time in months, he had a choice to make that wasn't about drinking or despair. It was about whether he loved his daughter enough to become the man she deserved to have as a father. The morning sun filtered through Thomas Mitchell's kitchen window as he sat at the table, the train ticket to Colorado clutched in his weathered hands. He had not slept all night, wrestling with the decision that would determine the rest of his life and his relationship with his daughter. Sarah found him there when she returned from the Henderson place, where she had been helping tend to their sick child. She took in the scene immediately, the packed satchel by the door, the letter from the rehabilitation ranch spread open on the table, and the look of desperate resolve on her father's face. "You're leaving," she said quietly. Sitting down across from him, Thomas couldn't meet her eyes. "That old Indian woman Winona, she told me about a place where men like me go to get better." "Really better? Not just dried out for a few days. How long would you be gone?" 6 months minimum, Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "Maybe longer if I need it. The letter says some men stay a year or more, learning how to live without the bottle and how to forgive themselves for the things they've done." Sarah reached across the table and covered his hands with hers. "I think you should go, Papa." Thomas finally looked up, surprised by her calm acceptance. "You do? The man who raised me, who taught me about trains and told me stories, he's still in there somewhere," Sarah said, squeezing his hands gently. "But he's been lost for so long, I think he needs help finding his way back." "What if I can't change?" Thomas asked, voicing his deepest fear. "What if the drinking has broken something in me that can't be fixed?" Sarah thought of Winona's words about choice and redemption, about the Lakota belief that no one was beyond saving if they were willing to do the hard work of healing. "Then at least you'll know you tried," she said. "And that's more than you're doing sitting here drowning in guilt and whiskey." The train whistle sounded in the distance, the noon freight that would carry Thomas away from everything familiar, toward an uncertain future. He stood slowly, shouldering his satchel with hands that shook only slightly. "I need to tell you something before I go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "about what really happened at the railroad tracks." Sarah stood as well, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "I know what happened, Papa, and I know someone saved me. What matters now is that you save yourself." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, seeing his wife's wisdom and strength reflected in their daughter's eyes. "How did you get so smart?" "Mama taught me that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened," Sarah replied. "It's about choosing to believe that people can become better than their worst moments." They walked together to the train station, neither speaking as they navigated the dusty streets of their small frontier town. Word had gotten around that Thomas was leaving for an extended visit to relatives in Colorado, a fiction that Sheriff Patterson had been happy to accept, rather than dig deeper into the events surrounding Sarah's disappearance. At the station, Thomas turned to face his daughter one last time. "I don't know what kind of man I'll be when I come back. I might not even be the same person." "Good," Sarah said with a small smile. "The person you are now isn't happy. Maybe the person you become will be." As the train pulled away from the platform, Thomas pressed his face to the window, watching his daughter grow smaller in the distance. For the first time in months, he felt something other than despair. It wasn't hope exactly, not yet, but it was possibility. Sarah stood on the platform until the train disappeared completely, then walked slowly back through town. She had arrangements to make. Mrs. Henderson had offered her a position helping with the household and the children, and the town council had agreed to let her stay in the small apartment above the general store. But first, she had a promise to keep. That evening, she made her way to the hidden valley where Winona and Lakota waited. The old woman was tending a fire outside her lodge while her grandson worked on repairing a bridle. "It is done?" Winona asked as Sarah approached. "He left on the noon train," Sarah confirmed. "The letter you gave him, was it really from a place that helps people like Papa?" Winona smiled mysteriously. "Samuel Morrison runs a ranch in the Colorado mountains where broken men learn to be whole again. He was once as lost as your father, consumed by drink and violence after the war. Now he helps others find their way back to the light." Lakota looked up from his work. "And if your father succeeds in healing himself? Then maybe someday we can be a real family again," Sarah said. Not perfect, but honest. "And if he doesn't succeed, then at least you will know you gave him every chance," Winona finished gently. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah settled into her new life in town. She helped Mrs. Henderson with the household, learned to keep books for the general store, and slowly began to heal from the trauma of what her father had done. Thomas wrote letters regularly from Colorado, describing the hard work of the ranch, the other men struggling with their own demons, and the slow process of learning to live without alcohol. His letters grew stronger and more coherent as time passed, and Sarah began to see glimpses of the father she remembered from her childhood. 6 months later, Thomas Mitchell stepped off the train looking like a different man. The bloated face and shaking hands were gone, replaced by the lean build and steady gaze of someone who had found his way back to himself. He had work clothes instead of the suit he had left in, and calluses on his hands from honest labor. Sarah was waiting for him on the platform, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, taking measure of how they had both changed. "I got a job offer," Thomas said finally. "The railroad in Denver needs experienced foremen, and Samuel Morrison gave me a strong recommendation. It would mean starting over somewhere new." "Together?" Sarah asked. "If you'll have me," Thomas replied. "I know I have no right to ask after everything I put you through, but I'd like the chance to be your father again, if you think that's possible." Sarah thought of all the conversations she'd had with Winona about forgiveness and second chances, about the courage required to trust someone who had betrayed that trust so completely. "It won't be easy," she said honestly. "There will be days when I remember what happened, when I'm afraid of who you might become again." Thomas nodded gravely. "I understand. And there will be days when I struggle not to drink, when the guilt tries to pull me back into the darkness. But I've learned tools for fighting those battles now, and I've learned that asking for help isn't weakness." They walked away from the train station together, not as the same father and daughter who had been broken by grief and alcohol, but as two people choosing to build something new from the ashes of what had been lost. Behind them, the afternoon train pulled away from the platform, carrying other passengers toward their own uncertain futures. But for Sarah and Thomas Mitchell, the journey they were beginning together was more important than any destination. In the hills above the town, Winona watched the reunion from a distance, satisfied that Elizabeth White Dove's final wish had been fulfilled. Both her husband and daughter had been saved in different ways and by different means, but saved nonetheless. The old woman turned back toward her hidden valley, where Lakota was waiting with horses packed for their own journey. It was time to rejoin their people for the winter, carrying with them the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories were won not through violence or revenge, but through the quiet courage of offering second chances to those who had lost their way. The railroad track stretched endlessly across the prairie, connecting distant places and distant dreams, and somewhere on those tracks a father and daughter were learning to trust each other again, one careful step at a time.